Right, so as Keir Starmer hands yet more billions of pounds to Ukraine to prop up a war instead of seeking to end it, still talking up putting British boots on the ground in Ukraine and painting a target on the UK for Russian aggression should he do so. The cost of Ukraine, as we all live through a cost of living crisis, is becoming a bigger issue in more people's minds as they increasingly struggle to get by. We're watching all this money going to perpetuate a war that should have ended 2 years ago if not for Boris Johnson's interference. Yet it seems Starmer can always find cash for his mate Zelensky, just never for the people of this country. We have to endure cuts, we have to tighten our belts because of the economic choices Starmer and Reeves are making, yet they can still give the equivalent of £1 billion a month to Ukraine. The morality and the righteousness of whether to support Ukraine and what shape that should take aside, the economic unfairness of who in effect is having to pay for it and go without here to keep a war we are not involved in going is a question few are seemingly brave enough to confront, preferring to bang the drums of war. And if Starmer is hoping to see a polling boost off the back of his actions here, he needs to be told if you want to send billions to Ukraine, stop making ordinary working class people be the ones effectively pay for it. Right, so since Keir Starmer's Labour government came to power in July last year, the UK has committed an astonishing £8.3 billion in aid to Ukraine in its ongoing war against Russia. It's a staggering sum. It's equating to just over £1 billion per month for every month Keir Starmer has been Prime Minister. He has, of course, been justifying this as a necessary contribution to global security and a stand against authoritarian aggression. Russia are very much the bad guys here. It's all very black and white as he would paint it. However, as British households grapple with soaring living costs, rising taxes and cuts to public services, the question of who is truly paying for this generosity has become an ever-increasing debate. Whilst you can argue for the moral imperative to support Ukraine, I would also argue the type and shape of the aid we provide, the scale of the UK's financial commitment to Ukraine, is raising serious concerns about the government's priorities as well, and the burden it is being placed on ordinary working class people. In July 2024, shortly after taking office, as Labour did, Starmer's government pledged the first chunk of cash to Ukraine, £3 billion in annual aid, vowing to sustain that level of support for as long as it takes. By January of this year, though, that figure had risen to £4.5 billion, apparently reflecting the escalating costs of the conflict and the UK's determination to remain a key ally to Kyiv, is how it was put. Though a cynic might suggest that Starmer's determined that this war could be turned to his own political advantage as his own polling numbers slid. He boosts support to Ukraine again. Move on to the here and now, though, and we got this announcement.
Our starting point must be to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position now, so that they can negotiate from a position of strength. And we are doubling down in our support. Yesterday evening, the UK signed a £2.2 billion loan to provide more military aid to Ukraine, backed not by the British taxpayer, but by the profits from frozen Russian assets. And today I'm announcing a new deal, which allows Ukraine to use £1.6 billion of UK export finance to buy more than 5,000 air defence missiles, which will be made in Belfast, creating jobs in our brilliant defence sector. This will be vital for protecting critical infrastructure now and strengthening Ukraine in securing the peace when it comes. Because we have to learn from the mistakes of the past. We cannot accept a weak deal like Minsk, which Russia can breach with ease. Instead, any deal must be backed by strength. Every nation must contribute to that in the best way that it can, bringing different capabilities and support to the table, but all taking responsibility to act, all stepping up their own share of the burden.
A further £2.2 billion in loans gets approved, purportedly to be paid for with seized Russian assets, but for one, that actually is only covering roughly a quarter of the loan, and for two, that actually amounts to theft. But on top of that, £1.6 billion in UK export finance is being used to buy Ukraine 5,000 air defence missiles. So this is money that isn't really even going to Ukraine. It's going straight to arms manufacturers to boost their profits because, let's face it, war is big business. And at the moment on the global stage, It is booming. That's £3.8 billion just in the last few days that Starmer has given to Ukraine in effect. They could have bought something like 20 hospitals here in the UK. But Ukraine needs our money more than we do, apparently. Cumulatively, therefore, this amounts to £8.3 billion in just 8 months, which is just the most staggering sum. And it made me wonder actually what happened to the £22 billion fiscal black hole Rachel Reeves said we had. Surely this is a sum of money we simply cannot afford as a nation, therefore. What it actually all comes down to, though, is government choice. Because there is always money for what they want, and as the old adage goes, there is always money for war. Understandably, handing all this money to Ukraine in the form of military aid particularly, as so much of it is, has come in for justifiable criticism as well, that the government's largesse towards Ukraine is being funded at the expense of ordinary British class people who are already struggling with the cost of living crisis, rising taxes and cuts to essential services being inflicted by the same government giving all of this aid away to Ukraine. The question of who is paying for this aid is not just a matter of fiscal responsibility, but it's also one of social justice, therefore. The UK's financial commitment to Ukraine has coincided with a series of painful economic measures at the same time. It's all Labour have been known for domestically now, isn't it? Rail fares, for instance, have just been declared to be going up by an inflation-busting 4.6%, adding to the financial strain on commuters. Council tax is set to increase by at least the standard maximum, as it seems to do year after year, of 4.99% in most areas, hitting everyone in the pocket yet again, whilst we all wonder what we're getting in exchange for that money. Water bills, meanwhile, are set to rise by up to 41%, unlucky if you're in Yorkshire, that's you, over the next 5 years, a move that's been described as completely unaffordable, not to mention insulting, as the river pollution these companies have caused, they are now charging us all again to clean up. Aided and abetted, it seems, by the water regulator Ofwat. Energy bills are also surging, another tale of privatisation hammering us as the government and regulators stand by and allow it. So much for renationalisation, because the gravy train continues. A 6.4% increase announced recently on the energy bills, bringing the total rise in energy costs to 18.4% since Keir Starmer took office just 8 months ago. Do you remember when he said he'd slash our energy bills by £300? I still do. But then we should all know by now what Starmer's word is worth these days, shouldn't we? People using public transport have also been hit hard, aside from the trains, with the local bus fares rising by 50% across the country, hammering commuters who travel by that method as well, as much as the case with those aforementioned rail fares. This has left many people, particularly those in rural areas, struggling to absorb the access to work, education and healthcare costs being inflicted on them. At the same time, inflation has reached a 10-month high, eroding household incomes and exacerbating that cost of living crisis even further. Add to that the government's decision to freeze the personal tax allowance, and we see the phenomenon known as fiscal drag come into effect. Whereas the minimum wage rises come the new tax year, as our wages rise by a little bit, the tax-free allowance does not. So any pittance we might get by way of a pay rise gets taken away from us in tax, dragging more people into paying income tax for the first time as well. It's yet another squeeze on household budgets, with little room to be squeezed any more. Therefore, the money handed over to Ukraine could have offset any of these measures as well. They could also have offset tuition fee hikes that are coming in when too many students are already using food banks. It could have covered the cut to the winter fuel allowance for pensioners, but Zelensky gets that cash instead, in effect. When so much cash is going abroad, and so little of it is being spent and invested here where it's needed, it's a natural train of thought, is it not? UK support for Ukraine outside of government is undoubtedly rooted in a moral imperative to defend democracy and resist Russian aggression, even if NATO expansionism also plays a very real part in that story too. 60% of Brits support Ukraine against Russia. However, it is also notable that 78% of Ukrainians back peace talks and not more war. However, the scale of the financial commitment raises valid questions about the government's priorities. Is it right to spend billions on a foreign conflict while British households are being asked to pay more for essential services? Is it fair to impose such a heavy burden on ordinary working class people, many of whom are already struggling to make ends meet, to pay for all this money to go to Ukraine? As far as Keir Starmer is concerned, the answer is yes. According to a poll out today, he's getting an approval ratings boost out of it, so watch even more money get announced in due course if that carries on. An 11-point swing in his favour, though it still leaves more than half of those polled thinking he's absolutely rubbish. The war in Ukraine is not just a regional conflict, but a global crisis that has obvious implications for international security, energy supplies, food prices, particularly across Europe. The UK's support for Ukraine is part of a wider international effort, sure, to resist Russian aggression and uphold principles of sovereignty and self-determination. Again, that NATO caveat where blame ultimately lies must, however, be acknowledged too. However, this does not absolve Starmer's government of its responsibility to ensure that its policies are fair and sustainable. Where other countries have also provided significant aid to Ukraine, they've also done so whilst maintaining a focus on domestic issues. The UK, by contrast, is prioritising its international reputation over the needs of its own citizens. So where Starmer might be benefiting from some faint praise right now, he risks fueling even further public resentment and distrust going forwards in the government if he doesn't start making people feel better off in this country as well, as he keeps promising. But again, we know what his promises are worth, don't we? The UK's aid to Ukraine also raises important questions about transparency and accountability as well, because whilst the government has been quick to announce its financial commitments on this score, it's been less forthcoming about how these commitments are being fully funded. But we're all feeling the where in our everyday lives, are we not? The public has a right to know how their taxes are being spent and whether the government is striking the right balance between international obligations and domestic priorities. And there is also a need for greater scrutiny of the impact of the UK's aid on the ground in Ukraine. And while the government has emphasised the importance of supporting Ukraine's defence efforts, there are concerns about corruption and mismanagement within the Ukrainian government as well. Therefore, the UK must ensure that its aid is being used effectively and that it is not being diverted or misused. And the rush to throw money at Zelensky at the rate it is happening again raises concerns on that front as well. The scale of the support for Ukraine, £8.3 billion in just 8 months, raises serious questions about this government's priorities and the burden it is placing on British people. At a time when households are facing rising costs, higher taxes and cuts to public services all at the same time, the government's decision to keep prioritising Ukraine over domestic needs is not a matter that is going to go away. And people deserve answers as to when some of the billions Starmer is finding will get spent on their needs too. As the cost of living crisis continues to bite and bite ever deeper, the government has got to start listening to the voices of ordinary citizens or risk becoming even more unpopular than ever before. And the question of who is paying for the UK's aid to Ukraine is not just a matter of fiscal responsibility, but also one of social justice. And we're not seeing a lot of that justice here in the UK right now. And of course, one other aspect which has really got people angry in light of all this money going to Ukraine specifically is that Keir Starmer has also slashed international aid by 40% in favour of defence spending here in the UK. And if you're going to keep on poking the Russian bear, I suppose you might consider that necessary. But again, it is not helping ordinary people out in their everyday lives. And now not even the small amount we used to help the most vulnerable people around the world matches to Starmer and co either. Why did Starmer bother to enter politics? Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content as well, to help support the channel at the same time, which is always very much appreciated. And I will hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers folks.